5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome to Roshango's Reviews, the show where I tell you my thoughts of the latest movies that come out in theaters near you, whether I liked them, whether I hated them, or whether I think you should go see them or not. I'm your host Aaron Bolio, and welcome to our 7th edition of the show. We were off last week enjoying the 4th of July weekend, but I'm sure as many of you know, even vacations you're still working, and I was pretty busy during mine. But I'm back to doing the show, and I saw a couple movies in the 2-week span, which was a nice thing, was I had a little bit more time to go out and see a couple flicks. Not too much came out, but some big-name movies came out, and the first of which would be Ted 2, the sequel to the highly popular Ted, a movie created by Family Guy creator Seth MacFarlane, a man who was known for creating Family Guy along with American Dad and The Cleveland Show. Its sense of humor has always been kind of mixed through crowds. It's not really about these deep scripted events. It's usually just kind of random humor with random bits, as hence the cutaways and all sorts of really bizarre out there gags like that. Some people love the humor, some people hate it. Me, I loved it until maybe about 2010 when the novelty kind of started to wear down. But I still think some of the older episodes of the show were absolutely hilarious. And that's what made Ted 1 so hilarious, was Seth MacFarlane is, whether you like him or hate him, a pretty talented man with several different voice talents, including the voice of Ted in this show. But I think the thing that made Ted so funny, the first movie, was the premise. It was the perfect satire material, because we've all seen the fairy tales or the children's book of a child's wish bringing their teddy bear to life or creating life, and they become best friends, and it's just a beautiful, wonderful story. But normally those stories end at childhood. This is what would happen if you grew up with your teddy bear wished friend, because it's not like he's going anywhere. You created life, essentially, and he's there with you. That life was created by John Bennett, who is played by Mark Wahlberg. Now, in the first movie, this was such a hilarious premise because a lot of the things made sense. At first, I thought it was kind of weird how nobody seemed to care that a walking, talking teddy bear was running around Boston, but they said it pretty clearly at the beginning. No matter how famous you are, there's a point where nobody cares anymore, even a talking teddy bear. And I thought that was really funny social commentary, and it was just really bizarre seeing a talking teddy bear voiced with pretty much the same voice as Peter Griffin hanging out with Mark Wahlberg and trying to get a job and trying to get his life together. Ted 2, I really enjoyed the premise of that immediately from the get-go, because they took that creative idea of bringing a teddy bear to life like in a childhood book and basically having him grow up in our world. In this one, the main conflict for Ted is that he discovers that because he technically was never born, he was made a factory and then a miracle brought him to life, he technically is not a person in the eyes of the government. And it creates a new civil rights issue that we've never seen before. We've seen minorities fight for their civil rights, and just recently we've seen gay and transgendered people fight for their civil rights. But we've never seen a talking teddy bear try to fight for his. And I thought it was a logical next step for the sequel, and that's what I really liked about it from the beginning. It wasn't just a rehash of the original movie. It was a true sequel. It was a continuation of a story. What was the story in this one? Well, Ted marries his very white trashy girlfriend, Tammy Lee, from the first movie. And things seem to be going kind of sour for their marriage. So that's when Ted gets the idea that they should try and have a baby. After a few different gags about trying to get a donor, especially Tom Brady, which I'll get to a little bit later, and even trying adoption, that's when the whole thing goes south. Because when they try to adopt a baby, that's when they find out that they can't. They can't legally do it because Ted legally isn't the person. That sparks the eye of the state and even federal governments, and all of Ted's credit cards, his job, his Papagino's rewards card, that's a gag in the movie, all that is canceled, even his marriage to Tammy Lynn. And that's when Ted decides to lawyer up and see if he and John can win a civil rights case. The first case doesn't quite go their way, so they try to go to New York to get help from the biggest civil rights attorney in the world. So, will Ted succeed in getting this lawyer's help, and will he succeed in becoming a person, getting his life back, essentially? Meanwhile, in the background, the Hasbro Toy Corporation has a sinister plan in the event where Ted doesn't quite get his citizenship. But I'll save that for the movie. So, was it as good as the first one? No, it wasn't. Unfortunately, it was not as good as the first one. But I will say this. I reviewed a few comedies on the show so far. I've seen Spy and Get Hard and couple other comedies. And I think this one, even though it isn't great, it's definitely the best comedy I've seen so far doing this show. It was actually had me laughing out loud, which is something I haven't done in a while at a movie. Strange, right? You go to see a comedy, think you're going to laugh. Me, I find something funny, but I never actually laugh. And this movie made me laugh pretty hard for the first half of the movie. A lot of the jokes were just really on point. And it really had that old school Family Guy sense of humor, which hurt and helped it in kind of different ways. You would get the cutaway gags like you would see in Family Guy. That was basically what I noticed from the get-go. I said, this is a Family Guy cutaway gag, except it's live action and not a cartoon. And a lot of those were kind of hit and miss. I think the movie would have been better as a Family Guy cartoon. The cutaways work better with the animation. They can do all sorts of crazy reactions and just bizarre out there events. It's kind of weird seeing it in real life, but almost treated like a cartoon. But even still, they made the humor was just fantastic for the first half. Then the second half, it kind of dropped off. It's not like the jokes weren't funny in the second half. It just felt like they weren't telling as many. It just kind of went from a comedy to a road trip at the blink of an eye. And it felt really disappointing. I had my hopes up for the second half of the movie. As the movie progressed, especially in the first 10 or 20 minutes, I was enjoying it the most, and I had so much high hopes to see where their wacky adventure would lead. And I don't know, it felt like they weren't trying to tell jokes. It just became a buddy road trip. Not to say that there weren't any bad jokes, there wasn't anything to not like about the second half. It just really wasn't as good as the first half. And unlike the first Ted, which was funny throughout, this one was a little inconsistent. But as I said earlier, the concept was great of Ted continuing on with his life and trying to get married. And they exploit this to the greatest end. The court scenes are fantastic, especially if you've seen the first movie and you know how John and Ted are. They're real blue-collar, not too smart, just jerk-off fun guys trying to take a courtroom seriously in a serious time in Ted's life. It definitely brought in some great moments. Also, trying to have a baby for Ted was really funny, especially if you are a Boston fan. You'll find a Tom Brady cameo, which is probably my favorite part of the movie. Whether you like or hate Tom Brady, it is a fantastic part of the movie. Along with many of the other celebrity cameos, Flash Gordon makes another cameo appearance in this movie, just as he did in the first one. And it definitely had some of that Boston charm, I guess you could call it. If you're from the Boston area or you're from New England, you really loved the first movie because it took place in Boston. The climax happened in Fenway Park, and they just had this real, it almost felt like they were telling a lot of inside jokes to people from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It felt really at home, and I think that might be off-putting to some who aren't from the state, but if you are, you really enjoyed the first one. And this one, they had that in the first half. The first half is spent in Boston, and they really, really exploit the Boston. And then once they go to New York, it kind of loses that charm, which I think is a shame because one of my big complaints about movies is they always take place in New York or Los Angeles. And I find that boring, and that's something I actually liked about the first movie. It took place in Boston. I've been to Boston. I love Boston. It was great seeing Boston in the movie instead of the usual suspects. And it doesn't even have to be Boston. You know, I'd settle for Miami or Kansas City or Chicago or just, you know, anywhere but LA and New York. Mix it up a little bit, you know? And I felt like they kind of caved into that when they had to go to New York at the end. Now, a lot of the jokes definitely didn't work, and I can see where a lot of people have problems. I think for starters, they had a lot of jokes revolving around marijuana, which, you know, some people, you know, the big debate about marijuana. I'm not going to get into the debate about marijuana, whether it should be legal or not. Personally, I don't care what people do in their personal lives, but that wasn't my problem. The marijuana jokes just weren't funny. They really, the joke was almost a lot of the time, they're smoking a bong. That's the joke. There was a few times, too, where it actually worked. They smoked a really bad type of weed, and next thing you know, John is clinging to the walls, crying, trying to go home. That's funny. That's doing something with the joke. But a lot of times, they just have John and Ted smoke some weed or drink a couple beers, and then you're supposed to find it funny or something? Why? Because the teddy bear's smoking weed? We've already seen the teddy bear smoke weed. We saw him do it a bunch in the first one, and we already saw him do it a bunch in the second one. There's just, I don't know, they're not adding comedic elements. It's not like Cheech and Chong where the marijuana sets up jokes. In this, the marijuana just seems to be the joke. And to go on that, the Family Guy aspect of it can get a little grating as well. I might have mentioned earlier that some of the gags don't work in the cutaway section. A couple of them were real hits, but a lot of them, they didn't really go anywhere. And as I said before, it probably would have benefited more if it was animated like a Family Guy. Instead, they just kind of tried to do a live-action version of Family Guy, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just doesn't always work. But even still, now, as I said, I'm a fan of the older Family Guys, probably from like 2000 to 2008, somewhere around there. Those are the ones I love. Those are the ones I always find quotable. And then after that, it kind of goes downhill. But I definitely get why people don't like it, because I know a lot of people that don't like it. And I used to question why when I was younger, but the more and more I watched Family Guy and watched American Dad, and I really never watched The Cleveland Show. Nobody did, but you could see Seth MacFarlane's humor definitely wasn't for everybody. And it definitely wasn't as smart as the other animated shows at the time, like King of the Hill or The Simpsons. If you're not a Family Guy fan, you're not going to like Ted. Either of them, really. So my final verdict for this movie, I'm giving Ted 2 a 7 out of 10. It was definitely one of the best comedies I've seen this year, probably the best, but I think there's going to be better ones to come. I would still say go see this. It was still pretty funny. It kind of let me down in the second half, and that was my biggest qualm with it. And if you don't like raunchy humor, or you don't like the kind of Family Guy random humor, I would stay away, because it's definitely not a movie that was meant for you. Now we're going to be moving on to another reboot of sorts, Terminator Genisys, the latest installment in the Terminator franchise that was so big in the 80s, then kind of dropped off, and then we had the Terminator Salvation, which was kind of a bomb a few years ago, and now Arnold's back, and that's the big news. Arnold Schwarzenegger, as you all know, was governor of California for a few years, and I'm going to look back on that when I'm older and kind of question what the hell people in California were thinking trying to put Arnold Schwarzenegger in government. The fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger was in government blew my mind, but I found that a detriment to everybody. I mean, debate how good he was of a governor, but we lost a good few years of Schwarzenegger movies, and that makes me upset. Think of all the fun we could have had at Arnold's expense. And that's the thing about Arnold. Everybody loves him, but nobody thinks he's that great of an actor. It's just, he's the king of one-liners, he's the king of corniness, and that accent just never gets old. And we've been missing Arnold for a long time, and it's good to finally see him back in a Terminator movie. Now, this one, I had so many mixed feelings in going in and out of this one. What's this one about? Well, for those of you who don't know, we created a computer called Skynet that was supposed to be the newest revolution in military and just overall technology, a supercomputer that can see and do everything. Except we made it too smart. It found out mankind was the biggest threat to it and launched nuclear missiles and did whatever it could to wipe us all out, leaving a small resistance of just John Connor and the human beings trying to rise up and destroy Skynet and take the world back from the machines. However, Skynet is pretty intelligent and managed to create an army of machines and, most dangerously of all, a time machine, which Skynet has used multiple times throughout the series in attempts to kill John Connor before he was born, or even John Connor as a kid. And in this particular version, they send the Terminator back in time to try to kill Sarah Connor, his father, back in the year 1984. And when they get there, they are met with an alternate timeline. And that is one of the things that really I found confusing, and I'm going to try to explain the best I can. So, John Connor leads the resistance against the time machine. It was a facility where the time machine was, and he knew it had to be destroyed if they were going to win. Meanwhile, another unit somewhere far away was battling Skynet. Skynet itself was destroyed, but the time machine wasn't. A Terminator was successfully sent back, and John Connor trusts his best friend Kyle Reese to go back in time and try to protect his mother and make sure that John was born. And that's when the whole alternate timeline happens. There, he's met with Sarah Connor and Arnold Schwarzenegger as her pet Terminator of sorts. Yeah, that's the thing. And that goes to my first complaint about the movie. It felt a lot more like a fan fiction than a true sequel to Terminator. Because that was one of the big things that bugged me. Immediately off the gate, they create some alternate timeline where Skynet instead is going to be called Genisys, and it's going to be launched in 2017 instead of 1997. And John Connor's father is different, and Sarah Connor is attacked at the age of 9 by a different Terminator, but another Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, saves her and has basically been watching over her ever since she was a child. And it really felt like somebody wanted desperately to make another Terminator movie with Arnold, and they kind of had to force a sequel that really didn't go with the timeline of the first 3 movies just to make this one happen, which, as I said, felt really fan fiction-y. It felt more like it wasn't like a big competent director or anything of that wrote this. It just kind of felt like a fan of Terminator decided to write their own Terminator movie or tried to make a different Terminator movie. And as far as Terminator movies go, it's okay. I mean, this one was panned heavily by critics but loved by viewers. I'm kind of in the mix. I don't think it was quite as bad as some people were saying, but it was definitely not a good movie. I'll get to some of the reasons why. First off, and this is the big thing, it was confusing. You notice how confused I was making myself trying to explain this? That was basically it. Just in a few scenes, they create so much confusion, and you immediately want not just answers, but just to unravel your brain of how weird and how much little sense it makes. It's just full of potholes galore. I'm literally watching the movie pointing out all these flaws, and I felt really bad when I should just be watching the movie. But I sat there looking. They had an army of Terminators. I don't know why they didn't use the time machine earlier. I don't know how Skynet has managed to create even newer machines, but somehow I'm not going to spoil anything, but it creates a new type of Terminator that's kind of like a human Terminator hybrid. That's the most I can say about it without spoiling it, because it is a critical twist in the movie if I go any further than that. But the whole time I'm watching, I'm just wondering, when could it do that? Why did this timeline get screwed up? the timeline gets screwed up because something happens in the future, so why does that affect the past? It's just every detail of this just completely boggles my mind. And they explain most of it. They definitely do get around to explaining some of the confusing parts, and you definitely feel good, but some movies are really good when they have that confusion or they have that mystery, and I think that's one of the big differences in a good way of executing this and a bad way. A good way is mysterious. You don't know what's going on, you want to find out, but it's not hurting your brain. You feel like the answers are coming. In this, it felt like they were kind of just making it up as it went along, and even they didn't know. And when good movies pull this off, at least, they know exactly when to explain the questions that you had, to answer those riddles that have been boggling your mind. This one just kind of starts explaining everything in the last, like, 10 minutes. Like, oh yeah, all those things you had a problem with earlier, this is what it was. This is how it happened. I don't know. It tried to make sentimental scenes serious that really were stupid, and it shouted a lot of exposition, which was my big problem with the first 10 minutes. It felt like all the dialogue wasn't me getting to know any of the characters. It just kind of felt like everyone trying to explain what was happening in the world, which that should go naturally with the script, but in this it felt really forced. The other big issue I had was the relationship of these characters. Now, Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese are, I guess, supposed to hook up. I'm not going to try to spoil any big twists or anything, but they kind of make it obvious that they want there to be a love interest between the two of them. But there isn't a single point in the whole movie where you actually believe that. They bicker and they don't even look at each other most of the time. I mean, it's better than Twilight, where it's kind of awkward and creepy. These two just look like partners. They never really look like they even remotely had feelings for one another. It just kind of looked like they were in the situation and they were sticking together because they had to, because they were being hunted, and because they had a mission to achieve. Not because they naturally fell in love or they found interest in each other or they were really characters. The only relationship really that worked in this was between Sarah Connor and Pops, what they nicknamed the Terminator that saved her when she was a kid, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now in this they kind of have to add something else into the movie where they claim that the human skin that the Terminators are fitted on when they're disguised ages, but the machine itself does not, which is how they explain how old Arnold is in this movie, because he definitely isn't as young as he was in those first Terminator movies. I thought that was a really, really dumb addition to the lore of Terminator, but at the same time, it brought us Arnold back in the movie, so you know what? I'm not going to complain, because frankly, Arnold was the best part of this movie. You even got to see a younger version of Arnold playing a different Terminator. But Arnold as Pops is just so fun. It's so fun watching the big Austrian hunk himself just play the machine, and he plays it so well. He has such a straight face, and he has some really funny reactions, especially one of the things they have as a running gag is when he tries to smile or grin, and he tries his hardest as a machine, but it always comes off awkward and creepy, and he does a great job. It's also just, you can take a movie more seriously the less Arnold has to say in it. And that's what they do. They leave him with little talking, but a lot of that old school 80s action that you loved about Schwarzenegger movies back in the day. And that was a big thing. The action was actually fairly good in this. There was a lot of really cool scenes. I think my favorite of those would probably be the bus scene on the Golden Gate Bridge that you may have seen in the trailers, where the hybrid machine is trying to hunt them down as they're driving across the bridge. And it involves ripping the underside of the bus off. It involves Arnold flying from the bus into another car. It was just an exciting scene. And there was another similar exciting scene at the end with the helicopter. But a lot of the scenes were really boring other than the action scenes. And even the new villain, which was really intimidating and presented an interesting concept, but a poor execution, I guess is the best way I can say it without spoiling it. But this new machine is basically invincible the same way the T-1000 was. You know, you could shoot it all you want, but it's just going to regenerate. And it actually does look kind of truly terrifying when it's melted back. There's a part where it's on fire, so you don't see its outer skin. All you see is its part, and it looks like metal muscles. Like if you look at like a medical chart and you see the muscular skeletons inside your body, that's what it looks like, but as an angry machine. And I said that visual was really cool, and watching it repair itself was really cool too, as it kind of had this, it looked like metal skin of sorts, just kind of fixing itself. But here's my thing, it never lived up to what the T-1000 is. And that's just it. The T-1000 is one of the most terrifying things in the history of action movies. Just the way they've animated that thing, the way its arms melt and form into new weapons, the way it shapeshifts. Just the T-1000 is so iconic. And it would have been one thing if they just did this movie and just kind of tried to pretend the other Terminators didn't exist, kind of like what they did. But they had the T-1000 in this movie. It was at the beginning of the movie. And they tried to make it seem like, you know, oh, if the T-1000 was this hard to kill, only imagine how hard it will be to defeat the next thing. Except, the next thing was definitely harder to defeat, but the T-1000 is just so iconic. And the fact that you actually got to compare and contrast the visuals of that liquid metal machine to this new kind of boring, muscular, human-looking thing, there's just no comparison. And that's the shame. It felt like they were trying so hard to one-up one of the coolest things in movies, and then just fell flat. And that's what I think the problem was just in a lot of this. It felt like it was really reaching, really trying as hard as it could to be as iconic and to be as memorable as the original Terminator movies, but it just continued to fail, and that was the problem. It just kept trying to create its own version of Terminator that just simply was not living up to the height of the other ones. And that's just a shame, really, because as much as I've been hard on this, it was enjoyable. I did get entertainment value out of it. As I said, Arnold was really fun to watch in this. He was really funny, but he was really hardcore and really exciting at the same time. The adventure and the danger felt real. Even Skynet actually gets a voice in this. They have Skynet literally talk to them and almost take a human form. And that, I thought, was a really cool concept. But it's just, there weren't enough good executions, and it just felt like a boring movie. So Terminator Genisys gets a 5 out of 10. I wouldn't really go out of my way to see this one. But I'll tell you what, if you do end up seeing it, you maybe not like it, but at least you'll get something out of it. It was definitely not like an empty movie, but it wasn't very good, and it got boring on a lot of scenes. And that will be my final verdict. You don't have to go see Terminator. I wouldn't recommend it, but if you're forced to go see it, you won't have a terrible time. And I think there are a few people that might actually enjoy it. So with that said, I will see you next week. I hope you all have a good weekend at the movies. I'm Aaron Bolio, signing off. Have a good night.
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.